perform his Railroad in Song program. He's been performing his original songs along with blues, rock, and country standards throughout his life. I think you're in for a real treat. This program this evening is brought to us by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and we do have another concert next Thursday. We have the Catnip Junkies coming in for a concert. So keep an eye on our calendar. I know you're going to have a great time tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great time, guys. Welcome, Jon.
So fast.
I can say more.
This is turned off. All around the water tank, waiting for a train, 1,000 miles away from home, sleeping in the rain. I walked up to a great man and gave him a line of talk. He said, if you've got money, I'll see that you don't walk. Well, I haven't got a nickel, not a penny can I show. He said, get off, you railroad bum. Then he slammed the boxcar door. Well, he put me off in Texas, a place I dearly love. Wide open spaces all around me, and the moon and stars above. Nobody seems to want me, nor to lend a helping hand. I'm on my way from Frisco, heading back to Dixieland. My pocketbook is empty, and my heart is filled with pain. I'm 1,000 miles from home, waiting for a train. Thank you. Thank you for coming out this evening, and thank you to Gladys Kelly Library for hosting this show. Thank you also to the Webster Cultural Council and to the Mass Cultural Council for supporting this program. I'm Jon Waterman. That song was Waiting for a Train. It was a big hit for a guy named Jimmy Rogers back in 1929. Are you familiar with Jimmy Rogers? He was known as the singing brakeman. We'll talk more about him a bit later. Yeah, Jimmy Rogers, that would turn out to be the second best-selling single of his career. The song, Waiting for a Train, is descended from an English music hall song called Standing on the Platform. It was popular in the mid-1800s. So in this show, we're going to look at the railroad in America through songs. So these are songs about trains, the building of the railroad, workers on the railroad, heroes, hobos, train wrecks, and songs where the train appears as a symbol. Usually it's a symbol for a passage through life or a symbol for freedom. There are a number of contenders for the title of first railroad in the U.S. In 1809, 180 feet of track were laid outside of the Bull's Head Tavern in Philadelphia, owned by Thomas Leeper. He was conducting a test to see if a horse-powered tramway could be used to move rocks from his quarry. The test was successful, and the following year, in 1810, the Leeper Railroad was opened. It remained in use until 1827. The oldest railroad to remain continually operating into modern times was, any guesses? Huh? It was right. It was right here in Massachusetts. It was the Granite Railway in Quincy. It was built in 1826, and it remained in use until 1963. And it was used to move the bricks to build the Bunker Hill Monument. In 1829, the Delaware and Hudson became the first railroad in this country to run a steam locomotive, the Stourbridge Lion, which was imported from England. And in 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O, became became the first railroad in this country open for public use, and the first to run an American-built locomotive, the Tom Thumb, designed and built by Peter Cooper. Music has accompanied the railroad since the first tracks were finished. Initially, the songs were ceremonial pieces written for the dedication of a new railroad line. The first one such song was the Carrollton March, which is the first railroad song that we know of. It was written in 1830 for the opening celebration of the B&O Railroad. Soon there were railroad work songs, spirituals with symbolic trains, and popular songs about workers on trains in the railroad. Engineers, conductors, firemen, brakemen, switchmen, steel drivers, porters, and section men. Section men were men who worked maintaining or replacing track as part of a section gang. A song about a section man called Jerry Go Isle the Car became popular among workers on the Southwest Santa Fe Railroad in the late 1800s. Around the turn of the last century, some folklorists became interested in finding the origins of the song. They tracked down a man who had been the manager of the Southwest Santa Fe line around the time the song was popular. He recalled that it had been written in 1881 by an Irish immigrant from Connaught, known only as Riley the Bum, and that Riley was a hard-working, quick-fighting, good-natured section man who was also a minstrel. That's a quote. It's an exact quote out of a magazine from the early 1900s. It's also all we know about Riley. But because Connaught was the province of Ireland hardest hit by the famine, a province where the effects of the famine were still being felt for decades afterwards, we can imagine that, like many of his countrymen, Riley came to this country to escape the hardships brought on by that tragedy. We can also imagine that, like many of his countrymen, he encountered discrimination when he arrived here. And since the railroad companies were desperate for manpower and not in a position to discriminate, Riley found his way into the hard life of railroad work. Because we know so little about Riley the Bum, I thought it might be nice to commemorate him in song and give him his rightful place in the pantheon of American songwriters. Come on, you railroad section men, and listen to my song. He traveled across the ocean to America, 'cause the famine was severe, there he was from. And he got a job working for the railroad, 'cause the era of the iron horse had come. Riley the Bum, he was known by the thick brogue that he spoke in, and the lilting melodies that he would hum. But when he was sore from working or from fighting, he poured the whiskey down till he was numb. Riley the Bum, he was a minstrel and a section man on the Santa Fe, and he wrote a song called Jerry Go Isle the Car. And if people rode west on the tracks, he lay for a line. And the song he sang is a time to another time. If he saw you rolling some tobacco, he might ask if you would lend him some. But he was never known to turn away some running need. He would share if he was down to his last crumb. Riley the Bum, he was a minstrel and a section man on the Santa Fe, and he wrote a song called Jerry Go Isle the Car. And if people rode rest on the tracks, he lay for a line. And the song he sang is a tie to another time. Yeah, the song he sang is a tie to another time. Oh, the song he sang is a tie to another time. Thank you. Irish immigrants provided the bulk of the labor in building the eastern part of the American Transcontinental Railroad. The American Transcontinental was the first transcontinental in the world. It was built between 1865 and 1869. The contract to build the eastern half of the Transcontinental was awarded to the Union Pacific Railway. The Union Pacific construction project started in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and worked its way west. The Union Pacific project was notorious for the corruption at the higher levels of the company, and for the hell-on-wheels towns that sprang up as railroad construction moved west. These were temporary towns rife with booze, brothels, and gambling. They'd set up the town where construction was going on, and then as railroad construction moved down the track a few miles, they'd pack up the town and move it along with the construction. An overlooked and underappreciated chapter in American history is the contribution of Chinese workers in building the western part of the Transcontinental. The contract to build the western part of the Transcontinental was awarded to the Central Pacific Railroad. Central Pacific had a hard time finding enough workers because there were so few people out west at the time, and because of the silver boom, which meant that men could make more money working in the mines than they could working for the railroad. So desperate for manpower, the Central Pacific started recruiting Chinese workers as early as 1865 when construction first began. They brought those Chinese workers across the ocean to work on the railroad. By 1867, those Chinese workers had proven so effective, they made up the bulk of the Central Pacific's workforce. They were tasked with clearing rock and drilling and blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada mountains and across the Nevada desert. They endured treacherous conditions, severe weather, and abuse, while being paid less than the white workers on the same line. The first transcontinental railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory, Utah. But few, if any, of those Chinese workers are represented in the famous photo of the Golden Spike ceremony that was held to celebrate the completion of the railroad. And afterwards, those Chinese workers and other Chinese immigrants continued to be subjected to prejudice and discrimination. Their story wasn't told in history books or in classrooms. And their story wasn't told in the promotional brochures handed out by the railroad. Because of that, we know very little about those Chinese workers. All we have are a few photos and letters. We don't even have any Chinese railroad songs. Most of the Chinese workers were recruited from Guangdong province in China. In China, at the time, California and the western U.S. generally was known as Gold Mountain, after the gold discovery of 1849. In Cantonese, the language of Guangdong, Gold Mountain is Gumshan. They headed east from Guangdong to Gold Mountain, hoping to leave hardship behind. But a hard life was in store across the ocean, breaking a rock and land trap on the Gumshan line. The railroad needed men to swing the hammer, but in the heyday of the Comstock Road, the white men made more money mining silver, so the Chinese came to work on the railroad. And it'd strike a match and pull them up fast, through the nitroglycerin blast, tunneling through the Donner Pass, activity to the day. With 700 miles a day, they would turn granite at a lower pace. They were singing Melody Orient, hey! Working on the Gumshan Railway. From the Far East, they went east through Sacramento, leveling the grade around Cape Horn. They moved the earth to make way for the trestle. They felt the crack of the wind in the Boston storm. Through the endless winter storms of 67, they shivered in their shelters in the snow. They worked the sheer cliffs of the high Sierras, with certain death 1,000 people. And it'd strike a match and pull them up fast, through the nitroglycerin blast, tunneling through the dawn some hope to save enough to have a future in a land that puts scant value on their lives. 'Cause the company kept the records of the Chinamen, knowing who their names were next of kin. Then many a man was buried near the rail side, whose family never knew what had become of him. Some were swept away in a rock slide or an avalanche. Some were frozen in the winter cold. Some were blown straight to the celestial kingdom while working on the Gumshan Railroad. They laid tracks that led to Promontory, Utah, where west and east in the spring of '69. But the thanks they got was hatred and exclusion for breaking a rock and laying a track on the Gumshan line, for breaking rocks and breaking their backs on the Gumshan line. Let's strike a match and pull a fast in the nitroglycerin blast, going through the dawn past that turns of the day. With 700 miles to lay, they were sure granted of a low thing. One thing to tell me you're yeah. Hey! We're working on the Gumshan Railway. Strike a match and pull a fast in the nitroglycerin blast, going through the dawn past that turns of the day. With 700 miles to lay, they were sure granted of a low thing. Hey! We're working on the Gumshan Railway. Thank you. A lot of the railroad in America was built by black Americans. In the years before the Civil War, slaves were leased out by plantation owners to Southern Railroad companies. And years later, a lot of black men were forced to do railroad work because they were convict laborers. They were caught up in a form of slavery, a new form of slavery that was instituted in the Jim Crow South after slavery was abolished. One of the legendary heroes of the railroad might have been a convict laborer. You probably know his story. You know the story of John Henry? John Henry was a muscular black man. Some say he was a giant, well over 6 feet tall. Others say he only stood about 5'1". Well, 5'1's a bit bigger than that. According to most versions of the legend, John Henry was a worker on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, the C&O. He was one of the men drilling the Big Bend Tunnel, or could have been the Lewis Tunnel nearby. John Henry was the best steel driver around. They say he could drive steel as fast as 4 men, and he was so strong he could swing a hammer in each hand. John Henry worked in tandem with a shaker. The shaker would hold a little steel spike in place, and John Henry would hammer the spike into the rock to make a hole, to put gunpowder in, to blast a bigger hole. That's how steel drivers made tunnels. Hammer the nail, hammer the spike into the rock for the hole, put the gunpowder in a hole and blast. Well, as I'm sure you can imagine, being a shaker for John Henry was a dangerous job. This little spike, big hammer. Boy, if he ever missed that spike, the shaker could get hurt real bad. So the shaker was scared all the time. He was always shaking. And that's why they called him a shaker, right? No, that's not why they called him a shaker. I'm kidding. The real reason they called him a shaker is that he would wiggle the spike as the steel driver hit it to help make the hole bigger. Anyhow, so as the story goes, one day the captain and the construction crew brings a steam drill to the site. The company's thinking about replacing all the men on his project with this steam drill. Now, John Henry, he took a lot of pride in his work. He wasn't about to be replaced by a machine. He said, that's not going to happen. I can make a tunnel through that mountain just as good as the steam drill can, or better. So they had a contest. They had a race who could tunnel farther, faster through the mountain. John Henry driving steel or the steam drill drilling. But John Henry drove steel so fast going through that mountain that the steam drill couldn't keep up. After a while, it started sputtering and wobbling. smoke started coming out, and down it went. The steam drill was out of steam. That was the end of the steam drill. John Henry won the race. But afterwards he collapsed and died because of the exhaustion and the overexertion. So when John Henry was a baby, he sat down on his father's knee, and he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel. He said, "The hammer be the death of me. Yeah, the hammer be the death of me." You know, the captain said to John Henry, "I'm gonna bring the steam drill around. I'm gonna bring the steam drill out of this job. I'm gonna walk that steel on down, boy. I'm gonna walk that steel on down." But John Henry said to the captain, "You can bring that steam drill around. Yeah, you can bring your steam drill out of this job. I'm gonna beat your steam drill down, boss. I'm gonna beat your steam drill down." And then John Henry said to the shaker, "Shaker, you better pray. 'Cause if I miss this little piece of steel, tomorrow be a burying day. Tomorrow be a burying day." John Henry drove into the mountain. His hammer was striking fire. He drove so hard that he broke his heart. Then he laid down that hammer and it died. Yeah, he laid down that hammer and it died. They say the man that invented the steam drill thought that he was mighty fine. John Henry drove 50, and that steam drill only drove 9. Oh yeah, that steam drill only drove 9. They took John Henry to the White House and buried him in the sand. And my man locomotive that goes roaring by, they say, "There lies a steel driving man. Yeah, there lies a steel driving man." Thank you. Well, a lot of research has been done to determine if John Henry was a real person, and if the contest with the steam drill really took place, and where it took place if it did. Back in the 1920s, folklorists talked to old-timers who had worked on the railroad, who claimed to have known of the real John Henry, or to have heard about his race with the steam drill. These folklorists pored over old company records and looked through old newspaper clippings. They compared the verses of every version of the song they could find, the details of every version of the story, details about how and where John Henry died, his having a wife named Polly Ann, and so on. Most of them agreed that the story took place in West Virginia, but a few argued that it had all happened in Alabama, or even Jamaica. One theory suggested that the real John Henry was a convict laborer named John William Henry, who was sentenced to hard time for the petty crime of shoplifting, leased out to the C&O Railroad, probably died of silicosis after working on the Lewis Tunnel, and then might have been buried by the White House. It was really the Virginia State Penitentiary that had been painted white. John Henry probably was a real person. At the very least, there were hundreds of John Henrys. Black men caught up in a racist legal system and an inhumane penal system, and forced to work to their deaths on dangerous jobs under unsafe conditions. In the version of the story we hear most often, sung in the folk genre of popular music, John Henry is a heroic figure. But among the underpaid and badly treated black workers, some of them being forced to do that work as convict laborers, would giving up your life to build a tunnel for a company really be seen as heroic? Probably not. And in the African American work song tradition, there's a series of songs called the hammer songs that start with lines like, take this hammer, take it to the captain, tell him I'm gone. And then the verses describe how they don't want to end up like John Henry. So in that tradition, John Henry's not seen so much as a hero, but as a victim. But in the folk genre of popular music, John Henry is a heroic figure. And the song is seen as celebrating the triumph of flesh and blood and the human spirit over the incursions of technology on a person's livelihood. And there's an underlying theme of work being the source of a person's dignity and what defines a person's life from birth until death. At the beginning of the song, he's born with a hammer in his hand. At the end of the song, he dies. So where did that all come from? And what about the contest with the steam drill? Where does that figure in historically? Well, there was an article that appeared way back in 1872 in a journal called The Manufacturer and Builder. And this article describes the test run of the first American-built locomotive, Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb, for the B&O Railroad, which had happened in 1830. According to the article, on the return trip to Baltimore, the owners of a local stagecoach company challenged Peter Cooper to a race between his new locomotive and a coach pulled by their best horse. You know what happened? The horse won the race because the Tom Thumb broke down. Now, that story is probably apocryphal. There's no evidence that that race ever really happened. The story that was printed in the article reportedly first appeared in a lecture given by a John H.B. Latrobe in 1868. Journal article is 1872, lecture is 1868. John H.B. Latrobe was a lifelong lawyer for the B&O Railroad. He was also a poet, and maybe more importantly, he was an inventor. He invented a kind of stove. Now, we can't know this for sure without having a transcript of the lecture, but it seems a reasonable guess that the point of that story is that new inventions might not work at first. They might break down. But eventually, over time, the glitches will be worked out, and the new technology will prevail, just as eventually the steam locomotive prevailed over the horse. Well, interestingly, in the earliest printed copy of John Henry, from 1900, the triumph of technology and the fight with technology seems to be the theme. The triumph of technology seems to be a foregone conclusion. One of the stanzas reads, John Henry was hammering on the right side, the big steam drill on the left. Before that steam drill could beat him down, he hammered his full self to death. So in that earliest printed copy, the triumph of technology is a foregone conclusion. So we have this story of a race between a horse and a steam locomotive circulating among railroad men in the years before the construction on the Big Ben and Lewis tunnels. Remember, those are the tunnels John Henry was supposed to have worked on. Construction on those tunnels started in 1873. Again, remember that journal article was 1872. Something else happened in 1873. The Panic of '73. It was an early Great Depression, an economic downturn that led to a cut in pay for workers on the railroad. And that led to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which started in West Virginia. So throughout the 1870s, we have an economic downturn, we have labor unrest, and when you have that, you have a lot of talk about work being the source of a person's dignity and fair pay and how work defines a person. So granted, this could all be a series of uncanny historical coincidences, but ladies and gentlemen, I submit that the story of John Henry racing the steam drill evolved out of an earlier story, a race between a horse and the steam locomotive Tom Thumb. And over time, that story evolved along 3 different themes. One theme, in the African American work song tradition, was a caution against working too hard for a racist and indifferent labor system. Second theme, following John H.B. Latrobe's lecture, was about technology and the inevitability of technology and the foolishness of trying to resist technology. And the third theme, in the wake of the Panic of '73 and the railroad strike of 1877, was a song about work being the source of a person's dignity and what defines a person's life from birth until death. And that last theme, the one we hear most often in folk songs, would have probably been the one most warmly embraced by robber barons and others with little concern for the dignity or safety of men like John Henry. John Henry had a little lady, her name was Polly Ann. When John Henry laid down in bed, Polly Ann drove steel like a man. Oh, Polly Ann drove steel like a man. We don't know if John Henry really had a wife named Polly Ann, and if he did, we don't know if she really took up his hammer and drove steel. But you know, women did work on a railroad. In both world wars, the men who worked on a railroad had to go off and fight the war. But the trains had to keep running because the trains carried the munitions, and the fuel, the supplies, and the trains carried the men. They carried the men to boot camp, they carried the men to the ports that they would go overseas from. So the trains had to be running, and women had to work on the railroad. Women worked as brakemen, women worked as firemen, women even worked as gandy dancers, and they worked in other capacities as well. It was hard, dirty work, but it had to be done, and women did it, and they did it just as well as the men did. And no doubt, some of the women liked those jobs and wanted to keep those jobs. But after the war, the men came back, and the companies said, no, you got to go back to being housewives. It would be, after World War II, it would be another 20 years before women would have equal opportunities in the workplace. Even longer before they would have equal opportunities in traditionally male-dominated professions like railroad work. Patty went to work on a Santa Fe. She took the job while the men were away. They fight a conflict on a foreign shore, and the trains carried the supplies needed for the war. She worked in the train yard scrubbing steel. She cleaned the boilers and she oiled the wheels. She made sure the trains were stocked with coal and sand. The war was fought with Germany and Japan. But Patty doesn't work for the railroad anymore. They sent her home when the men came back from war. She never wanted to leave that job, but fate had other plans. The company said she should stay at home, raising kids and rattling cans, like her mother and grandmothers did before. Now Patty doesn't work for the railroad anymore. Sometimes Patty worked on a signal crew. She'd man the towers as the trains came through. She might have even learned the gandy dance as battles raged off Midway and in France. But Patty doesn't work for the railroad anymore. They sent her home when the men came back from war. like her mother and grandmothers did before. Now Patty doesn't work for the railroad anymore. Thank you. Casey Jones is a quintessential hero in American train songs. Late in the evening of April 29th, 1900, Jones and his fireman, Sim Webb, fired up the engine for the passenger train, the Cannonball Express of the Illinois Central Railroad, for its 188-mile run from Memphis to Canton, Mississippi. Jones and Webb were making the run to fill in for another engineer who was sick. The train was running an hour and 15 minutes behind schedule when it finally left Memphis at 12:50 a.m. By the time the Cannonball had gone 125 miles to Winona, Mississippi, Jones had made up over an hour of time. Meanwhile, in Vaughan, Mississippi, 2 stops before Canton, a passenger train and 2 freight trains had to be maneuvered off the tracks in order to allow Jones through. Come on, you rounders, if you want to hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was a roller's name, and a 68-wheeler was a road. The father called Casey about 4:30. He kissed his wife at the station door, crawled in the cabin with orders in his hands. This is my trip to the promised land. Few South Memphis yards on a fly. Rain was falling and the water was high. Everybody knew by the engine that moaned that the man at the throttle was Casey Jones. Casey Jones, mounted in the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones, leaning out the window, taking a trip to the promised land. But Jones sat and wept, don't you fret. Keep shoveling the coal, don't you give up yet. I'm gonna run this train till she leaves the rail. Wanna make her on time with the sun and tail. Round the bend and down the dump. 2 locomotives were about to bump. Sim Webb said, Casey, look out ahead. Casey said, Sim, jump overboard. Casey Jones, mounted in the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones, leaning out the window, taking a trip to the promised land. With a hand on a whistle and a hand on a brake, North Mississippi was wide awake. I see railroad officials said he's a good engineer to be late. Headaches and heartaches and all sorts of pain, they're all part of the railroad train. Sweat and the toil, the good and the grand, are part of the life of a railroad man. Casey Jones, mounted in the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones, leaning out the window, taking a trip to the promised land. Thank you. As the train approached the station in Vaughan, Mississippi, the fireman, Sim Webb, shouted that there was something on the tracks. Jones shouted for Webb to jump, and Webb jumped. He was knocked unconscious by the fall. Casey Jones pulled on the air brake and reversed the throttle, trying to stop the train. He managed to slow the train to about 40 miles an hour before it hit the caboose. Casey Jones was killed, but among his passengers there were only minor injuries. Casey Jones was a hero. If he hadn't stayed at his post trying to stop the train, a lot of his passengers probably would have been killed. Casey Jones' real name was John Luther Jones. He took the nickname Casey after his hometown of Casey, Kentucky. And the story of Casey Jones has become a part of Americana. There was even a TV show made about Casey Jones. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Back in the 1950s. starred Ellen Hale Jr., who would go on to bigger roles. The song, The Ballad of Casey Jones, it's descended from a vaudeville song written in 1909 by Lawrence Siebert and Eddie Newton. They changed the story, adding verses that were not factual. One of those verses was about Casey Jones' wife being unfaithful. The real Mrs. Jones, who never remarried and reportedly wore black for the rest of her life, was understandably deeply offended. And for a time, that version of the song was banned in her hometown of Jackson, Tennessee. The vaudeville song, for its part, had been crafted out of a number of earlier songs, most of which are thought to have evolved out of a single song about Casey Jones. It's attributed to a black railroad worker named Wallace Saunders. That song has never been found, but that song is considered the original Ballad of Casey Jones. It might seem distasteful to modern sensibilities to write and perform songs about train wrecks, where real people suffered horrible injuries and grisly deaths. But that was a popular subject for broadside ballads, and also for a genre of rural music, a subgenre, called event songs, that became popular in the 1920s and 30s. Event songs were songs about sensational news stories: shipwrecks, train wrecks, floods, fires, storms, mining accidents, kids falling in the wells, blimps crashing, and so on. These event songs had a formula. They would describe the sensational news story in gory detail, and then they'd have a moral at the end. The event song craze started with a popular recording of the wreck of the old 97 by Vernon Dalhart in 1925. On September 27th, 1903, the fast mail 97 of the Southern Railway left Monroe, Virginia for Spencer, North Carolina on its 167-mile run. The train was nicknamed the Old 97, but it had only been in service a year. The engineer, Joseph A. Brody, was nicknamed Steve after Steve Brody, a daredevil who claimed to have jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge. The train was running late that day, and delivering the mail on time was taken very seriously by the railroad companies. Late mail deliveries were penalized $100 for every 30 minutes. It was after 1 when the train left the station in Lynchburg, Virginia. Its next scheduled stop was 64 miles away in Danville, Virginia. The train at 1:40. The train averaged just under 40 miles an hour, but it could reach speeds as fast as 90. Lying just before Danville, Virginia was White Oak Mountain, after which it was downhill into the town with warning signs and a posted speed limit of 15 miles an hour. Stillhouse Trestle bridged a ravine and small creek just before the town. They gave him his orders out of Monroe, Virginia, saying, "Steve, you're way behind time. This is not 38, no, it's 97. You must order and Spencer on." Steve turned around and said to his greasy, dirty fireman, "Just shovel on a little more of that coal. And when we cross that White Oak Mountain, you can watch old 97. Well, it's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville with a line on a 3 our grave. And it was on that grave that he lost his air brakes. So you see what a jump he made. He was going down a road, making 90 miles an hour, when his whistle broke into a scream. They found him in the wreck, with his hand on the throttle and scalded to death by the steam. Oh ladies, you must all take warning. From this time on and learn. Never speak harsh words. Your true loving husband, he may leave you and never. Thank you. Witnesses estimated that the train was going 90 miles an hour when it hit the trestle. That was too fast. The train derailed and fell 75 feet into the ravine. The engineer, Brody, and 11 others were killed by the collision and the scalding steam from the boiler. The song, The Wreck of the Old 97, has its roots in an 1865 song by Henry Work called The Ship That Never Returned. That song became very popular, and that led to takeoffs on the song involving other modes of transportation that similarly never returned. One of the men working on the recovery effort for the 1903 train wreck was a songwriter. He and a friend co-wrote a parody of The Ship That Never Returned about that accident, and that song, that parody, is The Wreck of the Old 97. That's why Charlie never returned on the MTA. On a cold, wintry night, December 29th, 1876, the Pacific Express of the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway left Erie, Pennsylvania. It was heading west with 19 crew and as many as 200 passengers. A blizzard had deposited as much as 6 feet of snow on the tracks. The snow was so heavy that a second locomotive had to be added to help move the 11 cars. One of the men on board was hymn writer and gospel singer, Philip P. Bliss. He was seated with his wife. They were returning home to Chicago. He'd been wired to return home early from a holiday visit with his family so that he could take part in the New Year's Eve service. Around 7:30 p.m., the train rolled across the bridge over the Ashtabula River as it approached the town of Ashtabula, Ohio. As the lead locomotive reached the far end of the bridge, its engineer, Daniel McGuire, suddenly heard a loud snap and felt his car sinking. Realizing that the bridge was giving way, he threw his throttle into maximum. His locomotive leapt forward, snapping the link with the rest of the train and barely pulling the small coal car behind it back onto the tracks. Safely on the other side, McGuire began sounding the train's whistle and ringing the bell to raise the alarm. Momentum moved the rest of the train forward as gradually the bridge collapsed, the cars falling and piling up in the chasm 76 feet below. Soon the wreckage caught fire from the tipped-over kerosene heating stoves and oil lamps that were not up to code, and an unknown number of passengers who had survived the initial crash were now trapped in the burning cars. Local residents tried to put out the fire with buckets of water. The town's fire chief, G.W. Knapp, was a drunk. He refused to give the orders to use the town's hand and steam pump fire engines. He said it was no use. Last stop, Ashtabula. Everybody all aboard. You can ride coach or first class, whichever fare you can afford. But rich or poor will get to where they're going just the same, because the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. Rolling west from Erie to Ohio or beyond, this here's a train to ride for those inclined to travel on, as well as all those going to where they always will remain, because the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. And if you miss this train to Ashtabula, there's no question to be saying hallelujah. Your faith, the hand of faith that hindered you from getting on this train. Yeah, last stop's Ashtabula, if that's where you're meant to go. But the tracks along the way are laden with a heavy snow, and there's a bridge across the river that's unsteady from the strain. So the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. Yeah, last stop's Ashtabula. Show your ticket to the man. Make sure your debts are settled and your affairs are well in hand, 'cause there are bridges you can cross where there are no coming back again. And the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. And if you set off from this station, you're going to reach your destination. That would be a celebration with the people that you know, or it's put you in condemnation to a place of tribulation on or off the fast track to the complex region down below. But if you miss this train where you are, there's no question to be saying hallelujah. Your faith, the hand of faith that hindered you from getting on this train. Yeah, last stop's Ashtabula. Everybody all aboard. If you're gonna see the devil, if you're gonna see the Lord, but even if you stay in this terrestrial domain, you know the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. Oh yeah, the last stop's Ashtabula for this train. Thank you. The Ashtabula train wreck was one of the worst train wrecks in this country's history. It was the worst of the 1800s. The official death toll was 92, but there was no accurate passenger list, so we don't know how many people were really on the train. So the number of lives lost might have been greater. The hymn writer, Philip P. Bliss, and his wife both perished in the crash. Miraculously, his trunk survived intact, and in it was found a set of lyrics that would later become one of the first songs recorded by Thomas Edison, a hymn called I Will Sing of My Redeemer. Bliss would be a tragic link between three infamous disasters. Years earlier, he'd written a hymn called The Billows of Fire for the victims of the Chicago fire. And years later, in 1912, another of his hymns, Pull for the Shore, was reportedly sung in lifeboats by survivors of the Titanic to keep spirits up. The Ashtabula disaster is as much the story of a bridge as of a train, and both bridges and train rides are used as a metaphor for a passage from one world into the next. Some say the Wabash Cannonball was a ghostly train that would mysteriously appear to take a hobo's soul into the next world after he died. And there's a variation of the song, Wabash Cannonball, that was passed along by hobos. So that variation was using a symbolic train. That's a different variation than the one that was popularized by Roy Acuff and the Carter family and some other people. It's our candy, so the people always say. From New York to St. Louis to Chicago, by the way. From the hills of Minnesota, where the river waters fall. No changes can be taken on a Wabash Canyon. So listen to the jingle, the rumble and the roar, as she glides along the woodlands, or the hills and by the shore. In a mighty rushing music, hear lonesome hobo's call. You're traveling through the jungle on a Wabash Canyon. Thank you. The Roy Acuff recording of the Wabash Cannonball remains the best-selling railroad song of all time. The recording was so popular that in 1950, a train was named after the song. At the time of the recording, there was no train called the Wabash Cannonball. There wasn't even a train called the Wabash Cannonball when the song first appeared in print in 1904. The song is descended from an 1882 song called the Great Rock Island Route. That song lists stops along the Rock Island Railroad. The 1904 printed version of the Wabash Cannonball has similar lyrics, but instead lists stops along the Wabash Railroad. The hobo variation lists stops along both the Wabash and the Rock Island Railroads, and also has references to hobo life, such as riding the rods and rails. Those references are completely absent from the 1904 printed version, and mostly absent from the popular versions, with the exception of that last verse, which mentions the hobo's call and traveling through the jungle, which is referring to a hobo jungle, or a camp. The railroad helped shape this country by carrying Americans from east to west. It also helped shape this country by carrying Americans from south to north, playing a vital role in the great migration of black Americans in the early 1900s. In the years after the Civil War, the vast majority of black Americans remained in the South. Most of them had no place to go. Most of those who did have a place to go had no way to get there. Many of them were sharecroppers. One of the few ways out was to get a job as a railroad porter. In 1868, industrialist George Pullman started hiring black men to serve as porters. Porters were servants to the first-class passengers on his sleeping cars. George Pullman was not being altruistic. His motivation was that he could pay black men less, and he did. The job was demeaning. In addition to being underpaid, the porters were often treated badly by the railroad and by the white passengers. But the job did offer a way to get out of the South and bring back news of other parts of the country. News of places with better living conditions, higher wages, and comparatively less racial hostility. And in the years after, the decades after the premature ending and failure of Reconstruction, black Americans in the South were, of course, subjected to terrible hostility. Jim Crow laws denied them their basic rights and dignities, and racial violence was widespread. By the start of the First World War, the Chicago Defender was the most prominent black newspaper. It had readers throughout the country, including in the South. Under its founder, Robert Abbott, the paper lobbied the federal government to do something about the racial violence that was taking place in the South. But the Wilson administration was unresponsive. So when the First World War stopped the influx of immigrants into the northern cities, resulting in a labor shortage, the Chicago Defender started encouraging black Americans living in the South to move north for those jobs that had come open. Black Americans heeded the call, and southern cities and states became alarmed that they were going to lose their supply of cheap labor. The people that they were taking advantage of and mistreating were simply going to leave. So more Jim Crow laws were passed, violent acts were committed, and intimidation was used to try to keep black Americans from leaving the South and to try to keep the Chicago Defender from reaching its readers. But the Porters were able to serve as an underground distribution network, and the paper continued to reach its readers, and the exodus out of the South continued. Between 1915 and 1930, 1.6 million left the South. That contributed to the growth of cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago. It ushered in the Harlem Renaissance, and it influenced the Jazz Age, and it helped shape 20th century American culture, played a big part in shaping 20th century American culture. This next song is about that. Some of the slides feature paintings by an artist named Jacob Lawrence from his Migration series, which depicts the Great Migration. They were going to Chicago. They were going to D.C. They were going to Ohio, and down in Tennessee. They were heading up to Harlem and the boroughs of New York. Got on board a train and headed north. Northbound train rolling off the track. On that train there'd be no turning back. Moving up the line, rolling over the town. They were riding on a train out to northern town. They got on board in Texas. They got on board in Arkansas. They boarded in the Carolinas. They boarded down in Florida. They left the Mississippi fields. They left the Alabama mines. Got on board a train and left Dixie behind. Northbound train rolling off the track. From that train there'd be no turning back. Moving up the line, rolling over the ground. They were riding on a train out to northern town. They got word at the station when the porter brought the news. It was time to pack their bags and put on their traveling shoes and embark on a migration for a northern destination. A more promising location for the promise of a nation off the Atlantic coastline and on the Allen on the Pennsy up to Philly, and off to Cleveland and South Bend, on the Seminole from Jacksonville, and on Marion. They caught the special from St. Louis